Okay, this presentation or this speech or this rant is going to be, is going to pertain to sexual modesty. And again, the fundamental flaws in considering sexual modesty as an absolute moral truth, as an absolute and transcendental moral truth. Okay, um, those who fail to conform to sexual modesty are often called immature, childish, uh, and that infers those who celebrate quote unquote casual sex or sex for recreation. And keep in mind, it does not necessarily have to be actual sex that I'm talking about. Okay, I can very easily tell you that if I if I found a way to organize uh, the celebration of phone sex with anonymous strangers, the modesty argument will still be dominant in the objection towards it. So it's not necessary. The modesty apologists or some modesty apologists will say that, oh, we're not against people thinking about sexuality uh, in a casual manner. We're against them acting on their instincts in a casual manner. So it's okay to think about lust. It's okay to lust for a movie star or lust for somebody, a stranger in a bar, but it's immoral to act upon it based upon the moral foundations of sexual modesty. And in my view, I think that's bullshit. I think that yes, there are some that truly believe that, but most of them, if you give certain examples, for instance, let's just say that we find out there's a woman who has phone sex with anonymous strangers, or a man that has phone sex with anonymous strangers. I think that many people in the sexual modesty camp will call that immoral based upon how that sexuality is being presented or being used. Okay, so it's far more than acting out. It's about the modesty apologists believing that there's a certain way of perceiving sexuality, which is the ultimate sign of a benevolent relationship, an ultimate bond between two people that is long term, and this only in that context. Okay, so what I wrote, and I have some notes here, but mature sexuality in the modesty worldview is framed as sexuality being expressed as the ultimate manifestation. So it's the ultimate, they frame sexuality as the ultimate manifestation of benevolent love. Two people who deeply care for one another. Okay, they see it as a celebration of two people who are very close in a romantic relationship. That's it, and that's the only context that they they find it moral. Okay, so when they're looking at when they look at someone like myself who has a completely different worldview of sexuality, and someone like um, Janet Mason here, they contend that it is not our motives of celebrating sex. I mean, implicitly, what they're really trying to say is that it's not that our motives of celebrating sex are not good. It is simply that our motives are not good enough in comparison to the ultimate benevolent celebration of love. Okay. Now we've seen that Janet Mason has a benevolent, romantic, loving relationship with her husband. Okay. The the apologist still has strong, visceral objections towards her celebrating sexuality from a lower level of benevolence. Okay, you can't say that two people who have sex just for sex's sake are fundamentally doing something bad. If you believe that suffering, if pleasure is good and suffering is bad, you have to most likely consider that act good. But the modesty apologist says there's only one standard of good in sexuality. Okay, there's actually two standards. The highest, either it's the highest form of sexuality is expressed as the highest form of benevolent love based on one's entire inner being, or it's close to it. I mean, these two people care for one another, and it's symbolic of a long-term relationship. Okay, clearly, when we look at Janet Mason in her movies and also in some parts of her private life, she does not have that. Okay, so basically, what I'm saying is that this is a hyperbole. Okay, they're saying that we're not acting good enough to merit what they believe is the ultimate end of benevolent love. Okay, so by using this hyperbole, casual sexuality is considered bad because it's not good enough. Okay, it's not. We misunderstand the modesty apologists. When they call something cheap, clearly they look at it as an immoral act. But fundamentally, even they must admit that fundamentally, from an epistemological level, it's simply that we are not engaging in acts that are good enough to have sex. You're not good enough. Okay. Um, now, hearing all this, I want you guys to think. Name me an act in any other domain where an act is considered immoral because it has weaker benevolence to the so-called benevolent act, the so-called ultimate benevolent act. Okay, so basically what I'm trying to tell you is that benevolent love, the concept of benevolent love, caring for one another in a long-term relationship is relatively the act of ultimate benevolence. And we're violating that. We're sinning in the secular level because we are engaging in acts that are weaker in benevolence, have less meaning in benevolence. Therefore deserving the hyperbole of being meaningless, which is absurd. Okay, that's what Dr. Laura. That's why Dr. Laura calls casual sex meaningless. Okay, because he uses a standard of ultimate benevolence. Okay, which is a hyperbole, which is fundamentally false in the sense. It's fundamentally false in a very very true sense. Okay. See, the problem is that I don't compare. I don't need to compare. And Janet Mason doesn't compare her sex with her husband that may map into being the ultimate act of benevolent love. Okay, and comparing that sexual experience with some very well endowed dude that gives her a good pounding. Okay, she doesn't look at that as well. Well, since this has higher meaning, therefore this is meaningless. That's a logical flaw. That's a logical flaw in Dr. Laura's argument. It's a logical flaw in any modesty apologist argument. And there's nothing really they can do to resolve it. There's absolutely nothing they can do. This is not being technical. This is being fundamentally true. I don't see the argument from the other side where they can sit there and dispute it. So there's no such thing as meaningless sex. Okay. Meaningless sex is a hyperbole because they're saying that the apologist who calls the sex cheap, meaningless, is trying to say that it fails to live up to the ideal or the vision of being a sacrament of celebrating benevolent love in a long-term relationship. Okay, that's what the apologist is saying. So again, my question is, name an act in any other domain where an act is considered immoral or implied as immoral because it is meaningless compared to another act. And I can name, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you examples of gestures and even words that are the same exact words that do not get that criticism. Okay, so let's look. So the first example I give is, okay, loving your country is considered far more benevolent or has far more meaning than loving ice cream. Yet you can say you love ice cream and you love your country. And people would understand the context of what you mean. Okay. Intuitively, they would understand the context of what you mean. So no one considers it cheap to use the word love when it pertains to ice cream, because is a there's a context of using love that has more meaning, which is your country, or you know, loving your wife or loving your mother. Okay. Clearly those things have far more meaning. Okay. It's not a it's not, you're not cheapening the word love by applying it in two different contexts. Okay. Let's look at symbolic gestures. Let's look at some symbolic gestures, physical gestures. Okay. And this is mapping closer to the sexual act, because the sexual act is often considered a physical gesture, but yet I just showed you phone sex. It's simply, I don't know, it's simply a metaphorical. It's abstract. It's in the mind. It's using communication. It's physical gestures in terms of communicating, but still we consider that more. The physical communication is more in cognition, in terms of two people sexually interacting with one another. Okay, so phone sex, is not as much a physical gesture. So I'm going to use. Let's just look at some physical symbolic gestures, um, that where you're using those gestures in communicating with one another, and sexual intercourse is often considered that. Okay, so we're getting close to, I think, is a pretty decent analogy. I know some people say that there's nothing more intimate than the sexual contact, and may not still disagree with the analogy, but I think it's decent enough. So let's analyze it. Okay, bowing down to somebody. Okay, if a guy bowed down to Justin Bieber today, and a month later bowed down to a revered monk, a revered Buddhist monk, how many people will say bowing down to Justin Bieber is cheap? How many people say that bowing down is being cheapened? I mean, you use that as a joke. Like, there's a guy that's looking at the sex symbol, and he bows down to her. He's a fan of this lady, and he bows down to her. Okay, she could be a model. Okay, no one says that bowing down in that context is cheap. Okay, and if this person bowed down to, I don't know, the Pope, no one's going to say that you're bowing down to that person is cheapened because you bow down to something that is relatively considered significantly less meaningful. Remember, it's the same act. Okay, so the argument from the modesty apologists is that, we have to have sexuality mean only one thing. If we have it meaning multiple things, people will get confused. Well, I just showed you physical acts where people You can use the same word, you use the same physical gesture, and they would understand exactly in context uh, the meaning relative in both circumstances. Now, keep in mind that I have offered solutions on how to ensure that the meaning and the context that I express sexuality is clearly substantially different than uh, the context of ultimate benevolent love. I've already given those solutions, so keep in mind I've already did that. But again, bowing down to somebody, a physical act that is done towards somebody in communicating. So it's an interaction. Okay, bowing down to somebody. Okay, can be done in a what you call it very meaningful context and a relatively less meaningful context. Okay, they're the same physical act. Yet my opponents here continue to say that, well, we should treat sex differently because of the emotions involved. Okay, and I just don't understand that. Okay, so what does this all mean? This means that sexuality, the physical sexual act, and the moral axioms that are associated with the physical sexual act, when it comes to apologizing for sexual modesty, is flawed. Because clearly, I can show different contexts, the same act, and people can understand. And it doesn't matter what the meaning is; people would not object to it. Okay, but yet in sexuality, there's this objection. And if the modesty apologist wants to understand my worldview of sexuality, that's the best analogy I can give them. Is that I can see sexuality in different contexts. Okay, in multiple contexts. One that may have the highest benevolent meaning, and one that has relatively a less benevolent meaning. But the difference between me and the modesty apologist is that the modesty apologist says that, well, that the act that has substantially relatively less meaning is immoral and cheap and shouldn't be done because it degrades sexuality. But yet he doesn't say the same thing for love. If I say I love my computer, and I say I love my aunt, he doesn't say that I'm misusing or cheapening the word love. Okay, if I give a handshake to my best friend and just somebody I just met, those that handshake in different contexts has different meaning. And probably my handshake with a friend that I haven't seen in 20 years is going to have substantially more meaning than a handshake of a stranger because simply they're on my team or somebody else's friend. Okay, so the meaning concepts will continue to use the word meaningless sex. If you're using meaningless sex in a moral degrading manner, you're trying to denigrate a sexual experience because it does not have, compared to certain sexual acts within a certain context, it doesn't have the transcendental meaning. I don't see the point in that. And I also don't see the point that Janet Mason cannot, because she's having casual affairs or casual sexual experiences with other people, that somehow cheapens a sexual experience with her husband in the context that they're having it based upon the relationship that they have. I don't see that. I don't see why that is so hard for the modesty apologists to understand. But it seems like it is hard for them to understand, and they continue to make these bold claims which have no evidence whatsoever. So that's the end of that's basically the end of my little rant. Okay, so fundamentally, you can understand as uh, somebody that is against or somebody who does not believe in sexual modesty why I have my worldviews. Okay, that's based on how my brain process. I mean, it's based on how my sexual taste. Part of it is, and part of it is based upon how I process um, sexuality and sexual acts in comparison to other acts. So I hope you guys clearly understand why I will always be against sexual modesty. It's not that I also I very often talk about the double standard on sexual modesty, but that is not my fundamental objection. Uh, okay, this is my fundamental objection. This is the if you're going to be a if you're not going to believe in sexual modesty, um, from my personal perspective, this would be your foundation. Now, the double standard does may give a hint of showing some of the fallacies in sexual modesty. It may not. You may try to say men are degrading themselves by being male prostitutes if they're having sex with women they want to have sex with. You could try to make that argument. You could try to make that argument, but you will fail making that argument because you actually have to demonstrate it. You have to demonstrate in what ways is the male body being degraded and how are men as a gender being degraded. It's similar to how conventionally we say women are conventionally degraded. One single woman's a prostitute, legal prostitute in Nevada. She is in the act of demeaning all women, and they're not using it as hyperbole or just a general statement. It's said as fact. So the other side has to present more evidence. And in saying that,